Marijuana is a great example of how just compartmentalizing one organ would leave you missing the bigger punchline of what this molecule really does to the development of a proper human, and then the healing that people really want it to do, but the evidence is not there.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and then this is where you get a lot of that vitriol and hate.
We believe that you are strong by design, and you were made in God's image to have a strong body, mind, and spirit. You're listening to the #1 Strength and Health Authority podcast in the world. So let's get ready to unlock your potential and transform your life in today's episode.
Hi there. Welcome to the Strong by Design podcast show. Talking with you today, Coach Chris Wilson. So glad you've joined us. The show is entering into the end of 2022 here. We're very festive on the show today, which is great. I have a little Dr. Elf in the house. I had no idea you had a hat with you, so I said, "Well, that's perfect. Bring that in and put that on." And you have the very fancy necklace. Our guest today is a return guest here on the podcast. It's so great to have her back, and we have obviously a very interesting topic that you no doubt already know what that is because you clicked on it because you saw the title and you're like, I need to hear this. And so this is going to be really, really good. Excited for this. Possibly a two-part episode based on how long-winded we get. So I'm just putting that out there to begin. I want to say thank you so much to all of our listeners on this podcast. This is, again, as I say repeatedly, just something that we so enjoy doing. We take turns here hosting. Mike will host episodes. Jared will host episodes. In the past, we've had Brian and Tanya doing episodes here, so it's a team effort to make this podcast. But it all is based on our strengths and personalities that we have here, and try to match that with the guests that we have. And it's just been such a fun ride for the last 5 years. And the show's continued to grow. This year has been a huge growth year for us. Our show has grown by over 50% over last year. So 2022 has been nothing short of fantastic for the podcast. And so 2023 coming around the corner is exciting as well, with lots of great conversations coming. So thank you so much for being a listener and supporter of the podcast. If you would, towards the end of the podcast, or even right now, if you want to hit us with a 5-star or leave us a review of any kind based on a prior podcast that you heard, or just the show as a whole, what it means to you, what you like about the show, what you'd like to hear more of on the show. We would like to know. So please give us some feedback. And I'll ask one other thing of you. If you would share this podcast with a friend or a family member, certainly this topic, highly controversial, really something that's totally taken on a whole new, persona, if you will, in the last decade, with the way this country, right, has changed in how we view this particular thing. So share this with somebody who would benefit from it or who would probably be interested in it, because we want this episode to reach more people. So thank you. So our guest today, the one and only, the amazing Dr. Annette Bosworth, thank you for coming back to the podcast.
Absolutely. Chris, I'm just thankful to be in your community and then having the relationship of just a colleague and a friend who's in the space of using your gifts and then spreading them through the 22 social media worlds where people pay attention. I think it's a huge pivot from where even my career was 4 years ago, and then knowing that the reason we stay in this space is how attractive it is that education, like what we'll talk about today, but also several of the other topics that you guys have shared across the podcast, it's the threads that do improve our communities. And I just appreciate the invitation, and I feel honored to be part of this.
Thank you. That means a lot. Thank you very much. Yeah, because I think conversations it's kind of like the centerpiece of like what makes humans human, right? Is like connecting and listening and learning and storytelling. And that's all we're doing here on the podcast. And that's why podcasts have become so huge in the last 10 years, is because people love to take part in a conversation or listen in on other people's conversations, right?
Right. That tribal attraction to sit around a campfire and either listen to a story, even though you've heard it dozens of times before, that is absent in our world today. And podcasts do fill that void in a way that is enriching, and the privilege to listen to experts and people whose histories should change other people's lives, but often stay buried.
I know it. Yeah, it's an outlet for us. And these are conversations, too, that I maybe wouldn't typically have. But this gives us the platform and the reason to have the conversations. Like, ooh, I know what I can do with this person. They're intriguing. They have something to say. They present on stage or whatever, but this would make for a great conversation and to share with thousands of people on the other end. So and it's heard all over the world. This podcast, and we're not Joe Rogan, right? We're not reaching millions and millions of people, although our platforms collectively do reach millions of people on a regular basis, which is pretty neat. But our show is growing, and we're heard in 80 countries.
Oh, my word.
When I look at our statistics, it's great. Now, most of these downloads are coming inside of those probably first 10 to 20 countries, from obviously North American countries to UK, Australia, mostly the English-speaking countries. But then, I'll see like 300 downloads in like the Philippines or 200 downloads in like a Caribbean island, and it's just really interesting, or an African country, and I'm like, how cool is this? We're reaching people in these little pockets of the world that we'll never meet, and we're having an impact, and they're coming back for more conversations down the line. So that's so cool. So the topic at hand today is marijuana and your brain. And this is something that, listen, I grew up, I was very much a kid who respected, I know it sounds weird, I respected drugs or drug impact. And so I was very afraid. I don't know why I was so afraid, because I wasn't really exposed much to it. I was around my parents, who did both smoke cigarettes, because everybody smoked cigarettes in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. So I was around that. I was around drinking. My dad was an alcoholic. So I was definitely not, I don't know. I wasn't somebody that was like not, around some of this like abusive type behavior or addictive type behavior. But I always knew that like certain illegal things were just off limits. So I never really wanted to be around it or associate with it. And I got through all of high school and most of college without even one inhale of like a joint. And I remember the first time I did it in college, I was like, I felt weird, I felt guilty, and I also felt like it didn't really have any effect on me.
What year was that?
I don't know. Probably would have been like 1998, 1999.
That's the weak stuff.
Yeah, that was probably the weak stuff. It had like no effect on me. And, but it wasn't anything that I was really drawn to. I never really liked I didn't really like indulging in things, recreational things that altered my state too much, where I felt out of control of myself. And so, as I've gotten older, like I drink a little bit, but very little. It's more occasional, beers here and there, or a glass of wine with my wife or something. It's not much. But I was intrigued by this topic because we met up again with each other 2 months ago in October. Yeah. And it was great to see you again. I was hoping I would see you there, and we did. We got to talk briefly, and I was like, I got to have you back. I don't care what we talk about. I just want to have you back. And we didn't even know what we were going to talk about. And we talked through email, and this topic came up, and you shared a webinar that you did with me. That got my attention. I watched the whole darn thing, and I took pages of notes on it. And the topic of marijuana and your brain, because I've been doing a lot of looking into brain health and the way our brain, our cognitive function changes as we age, and how movement of the body is tied to brain health.
Amen. Yep.
That's been fascinating for me, and I did a lot of learning and education on that brain health this year. And so I said, ooh, marijuana becoming so socially acceptable and really growing it, right? And you can get it anywhere nowadays. You can't drive down the street without finding one of these, what do they call
Dispensaries
them? Dispensary. And this is all over the country. And so I think people are kind of starting to just buy into the fact that, okay, this is totally fine for us. In fact, maybe it's even just good for us. It's good. It's like a glass of water with lemon in it. It's so good for us. And I was like, I'm not buying it. I'm not buying the fact that it's just good for us. So I'm like, I want to talk about this. And then I watched your video, like I said, and I'm like, okay, let's have her in and let's just talk about it. So I don't know where we begin.
I can start by saying, first of all, that video that I shared, and I'll ask you to link it in the show notes.
Yes, it will be linked, yes.
Because they can't search it on my channel and find it. I've actually unlisted it, that the data and the science behind marijuana and brain health, it just brings out the intensity of people that are not willing to listen to what the evidence really has been showing for years. It is a political message that is absent of some links to some science. And, people will, when it was public, there was just so many comments on it that I just said, I'm not reaching the people I wanted to, which was to educate people on what does the science say? What is the real connection between using this mood-altering molecule and what does it do? As you look at the other things that I've done education on, like alcohol or a brain injury, it's nothing compared to what happens when they get a hold of somebody saying something negative about their precious little plant that has been just morphed into a dissociative chemical that really, the value of what I go through in that series. And the series actually was something I might not have done in a public space had it not been for one of the many across the country referendums that was being sent to a vote. It's when I lived in South Dakota, and South Dakota is still, as of the recent election, it is still illegal to have marijuana in the state of South Dakota.
One of the few, right? Because we're down to what, like maybe 10 or
I thought
so
it might be single digits. I don't know.
It might even be single digits.
And you look at that, and part of that was, very passionate for where my kids are growing up, where my patients are getting education. As I said last time, I have moved to Florida, so it's not my state anymore, but it's my home state. Yeah. And that connection was funded by the people who were looking at how do we educate the voters of South Dakota. So as I did that 3-part series, it made me slow down and review the evidence of what I had been teaching to patients in an exam room, and also had done several workshops, but maybe the slides hadn't been updated in 2 or 3 years, and it was amazing to me to revisit what the data was even more aggressive about saying when it comes to how marijuana affects the brain.
Well, and just because I didn't say it at the start, and I want to make sure our listeners are aware of this. You are an internal medicine doctor,
yes.
right? Mm-hmm. An internist. You have been practicing for a couple of decades now.
Right.
And this gives you great insight into the internal functions of our body, of our organs, of how things are supposed to be working and optimally working, correct? And kind of from the, say, if you will, the anus to between the ears, right? Yes. It's kind of like that's your specialty. You're not looking at like how the knee joint functions so much. It's like how what's the digestive system up to these days, and how does that affect, as your second brain, how does that affect this brain, right? And all of the hormonal things. And
the interconnectedness of internal medicine, we covered this on the last one, so you can go back and listen to that.
Yes.
But the punchline is it's a depth of understanding for multiple disease organs within the body. And marijuana is a great example of how just compartmentalizing one organ would leave you missing the bigger punchline of what this molecule really does to the development of a proper human, and then the healing that people really want it to do, but the evidence is not there.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and then this is where you get a lot of that vitriol and hate
goodness.
from, and what led you to, as you said, unlisting basically a video it's still there, but it's hard for people to locate.
Right.
If they did a search, they would probably never see it. It would be more of a shared, and they'd have to be shared with them type thing. And I get that. I mean, there's videos. People feel very strongly about something, even though they might not really know all they need to know about it, and they become closed-minded a little bit. And it's like in the land of of tolerance and all of these other things that people are screaming about, like that we should be more tolerant. It's like people can become very judgmental, very closed-minded when they don't have all the data and all the facts. And you get somebody that thinks, because they've done some Wikipedia searches and talked to a few of their friends who are all burners or whatever you want to call them, right? That they know more about the impact of marijuana on your body or your brain better than someone who's been practicing medicine for 20 years.
Right. Well, and I think one of the most powerful parts, one of the places where I first got to see a deeper layer of the understanding of marijuana is I wouldn't research it as thoroughly as I did had it not been for one of my favorite things on my resume was when I was asked by Department of Defense to teach the soldiers and the leaders how to improve brains that were injured. So it was a brain injury workshop over 20 hours or over 12 hours long, and I'd done it over 20 times for the Department of Defense. And in the lineup, it was a week-long training where my part of the delivery was right after the marijuana guy. And the first time it happened, I didn't want to be late, and so I was probably an hour early for my part of the presentation. And it was just fascinating to see the man who was delivering that information his name was Moses, and he is now retired and does the education, but he had been an undercover officer to break up the trades of illicit drugs in the Midwest. Wow. So it gave him the privilege of walking into the lives of people and then living in the that covert space of what does it look like to be a sober, non-addicted, non-using member of inside a cartel, essentially.
Right.
But what he had access to is the data that sometimes doesn't make it to the public world for certain years on how much that marijuana effect was happening, and what are the data that I would have never kind of got into the depths of it as much had it not been for this guy's presentation. Wow. And the place where he uses, not only were his stories very engaging to hear how dangerous that was, but it was also the information that comes out of Colorado being one of the first in the country to legalize this and make it a open space for how marijuana is used in their communities. And then what those physicians, those communities, those commissioners, city councilmen have really struggled with as a population really covets that identity that we use marijuana. We don't shame for it. And then what has happened over the last 30 years to their population, their audiences of adolescents, of children being born to mothers that use it, the development of how much it takes a developing brain that was exposed to this in utero and then exposed to it as a child, and then how universally parents were giving it to children thinking it was going to match all of these headlines that nobody was checking what these people were saying to them. They were just dishing out what the claims would have been for using THC, or even even CBD was being misled in several ways. So I just want to say that the source for where this information came from is definitely, I mean, I gave that lecture a dozen more times after I came upon that this guy was right before me, and I never missed one again, just to listen what his updates were a couple times a year, to go have him review the data, have him look at what the reports that the government does require the municipalities to report in their areas for high marijuana users, and what that was doing to their cities, their kids, their traffic accidents, and their dementia rates. I mean, when you look at brain health, they've got the data. It's not new. He was still 3 years in the rear, and that was in 2019, the last time I was able to share space with him before the pandemic. And it still blows my mind that it's that prominent, and the information is so, it is not a subtle part of the information of what it does to human brains. It is a striking difference, and the data's out there to prove it.
I mean, and this is just speculation or just kind of a side topic, but is it because it's such big business that it's become so prevalent and so accepted? Is because people are like making their livelihoods off of this?
Yeah. I mean, part of that, I think, is the business behind it. That's going to be one thread. I also think it's been that push against big government where they said we couldn't, now we can, we win, and I'm going to show you. So even if there's no sense behind it, this is what we're going to do. Like
there was prohibition, and then we're like, yeah, we'll show them, and now we can all drink legally. Now we've all been drinking ourselves, plenty for the last 80 plus years, right? And but it's funny. It's like you wouldn't want to see a 7 or 8 year old drinking, right? Beer or alcohol or wine or anything else. But we're perfectly fine with somebody twice that age, I guess, like getting involved while they're still growing and developing, and it's okay for teenagers, or it's not okay. Where's the threat? Where's the line? Like, it's okay once you're 20? Like, as a parent, I'm just talking to parents right now. Like, are you, like, say you're pro marijuana as a parent. Is that good for your kid? Are you pro for your kid to do it? Or do you feel like your kid, they can make their own mind up once they're 18, or it doesn't matter anymore? Or because you were pro, they're probably going to be pro, which means they're probably going to be pro pretty early, and they're going to be experimenting, whether you like it or not, when you're not around at 10, 11, 12 years old, when kids are trying things out.
Absolutely.
And, I mean, I just think, like, do people think of, like, the consequences of their, like, desire to see things that once were illegal become legal, and then whether it's good or bad or indifferent, but because I like it, I'm going to be on board with that. I don't know. There's a whole conversation there that we could go down with all of that stuff. But I really did want to stick to what does this do to us? Because so many people don't really have any idea. They just know they like how they feel when they do it.
Right.
Right? It's calming. I feel like if I'm in pain, so I do it because I'm in pain, and it makes my pain go away, or it makes me forget about my problems, or it relaxes me before I go to bed, or, I just feel like I'm not hurting anybody, so I'm just going to do it for myself, and it doesn't have any negative effects on me.
Right. Well, I would definitely like to.
That's what a lot of people think, I believe.
It is true, and it just reminds me of the comments that came to this video. So that dissociation is what you were describing there, yes. And that dissociation is what happens when a mood-altering chemical binds in our brain, especially in some of those primitive parts of the brain, the deepest parts of our brain. And let's start with kids.
Yes.
When you're looking at kids, as I'm talking to parents, and again, my clinic has been, hitting peak brain performance in life, and as much as that will bring me folks with Parkinson's or with sleep problems, there's quite a gamut of folks who've had addiction. And so when you look at teenagers that are stuck in a rut with addiction, that entrance drug is very commonly marijuana today. Yeah. It is the number one. Alcohol still ranks nationally as the number one entrance drug, but in my practice,
cigarettes are probably right there too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, nicotine is a drug, right? It's just,
Yep, different avenue of
avenue, but that's a gateway to smoking marijuana, isn't it?
Right. So all of those are when you look at a child's development of their brain, and I think we talked a little bit about this last time, that the most important part that you should be thinking about is that they're copying what they see. So let's take cigarettes for just a second, because it's a little easier and not as inflammatory as marijuana is. But when Mom says, I never smoke in front of the kids. And I said, okay, I get that. But what happens when you're stressed out? And she goes, I go to the garage, I smoke the cigarette, or I get in the car and I drive around the block and I smoke the cigarette and I come back and then I'm there. And I said, so tell me what the point of view was from the child. And it's almost like many times the first time they've thought of that. I'm like, well, I wasn't smoking in front of them. I'm like, yes, but you were absent in the present time when they were looking for what's the example to deal with this stress. So the power you have as a parent is, they will copy you. The specific nerves they're using in your brain are called mirror neurons, and it is why a quarterback will have a son, and the ability for that son to do things a quarterback can do is because they've watched it without words associated with it from a very young age.
Yeah.
And even if they didn't do it, they watch it, they see it, they hear it. That mirror neuron is how you learn as a child.
Yes.
There are other ways you learn, but as an adult, if you didn't learn something as a child, you now need to find a way to see something that really you only had the privilege of seeing in those developmental years between a parent and a child.
And look how many professional athletes, any sport, who have children. I guarantee you the percentage of professionals who have children who become professional, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Same
is
thing.
way better odds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Than the average person.
And that's what's happening in their brain is those little, you can't script this. So in the moment where the mother says, I disappear to have the cigarette, the coping skills that were required that the child would have learned, whether that's crying, throwing something, whether they're good coping skills or not, isn't what I want to point out. I want to say that they didn't see any. They saw you disappear. And the absence, that vacuum, is where it gets filled in with things that of today's world. So parents, pay attention, having these conversations super young, having those vulnerable moments of the things you do well and the things you don't want them to copy. And then, for heaven's sakes, keep working on you. That's the most powerful impact you can have on your child. But let's get back to the development of that brain. Because that human brain as a child, the word I like parents or to remember, patients too, is your hippocampus. Again, this really primitive part of your brain. And it
looks like a seahorse.
Yes. Hippocampus means seahorse, and it is the Latin word that, by golly, those first folks that dissected that out of the brain were pretty close. It looks kind of like a sea monster. So.
Yep, it does.
When I watch how that I was that mom that went to middle school and talked to the middle schoolers about brain development, and I had this great teacher who invited me back year after year, even when my kids weren't part of her class, to talk about brain development and how important that hippocampus is. And I taught them that word. They would find me in the grocery store years later saying, "You taught me about the hippocampus," and instantly I knew I met them in middle school.
Yep.
But that is because that middle school brain is one of the places where it's growing the fastest. And I would tease them saying, "Who in this room," and it was usually an assembly of like 400 kids, wants to be the most successful, wants to have the best success. And you'd see all these kids raise their hand. And I'm like, do you know that I could measure something in your brain that would actually predict who's going to be the most successful? And then I would back up a little and say, now we're going to say that success is the ability to learn something quickly, to retain it, to maintain friendship relationships over time, and then to acquire success. Like monetary, I tried to stay away from the word money, but to acquire the assets of success. And so without using the word money, it was really looking at that peak performance of brain is related to the length and volume that we can measure in your hippocampus. And then I would, be up there in my white coat and say, whose hippocampus do you think is better, yours or mine? And, there was a few other statistics I'd go through, and they would then say, well, the lady in the white coat with the stethoscope must have the better hippocampus. And I'm like, nope, actually yours is, because yours is growing and will grow exponentially over that course of right around puberty. In fact, the year before puberty, which is why that girl brain is starting to mature before a boy brain. And then we can see it mature, especially boy brains, all the way up to that 26th year.
Wow.
That we see how big you can grow this hippocampus in the years between that advent of puberty and those sex hormones through that 26th year of brain development. Wow. And I use Michael Jordan as one of the biggest, thickest, longest hippocampus.
He's got a big old, long, thick hippocampus, and we're not getting dirty. It sounds silly, but I was laughing in your webinar when you got to Michael and you show a picture of him, and I'm like, wow, he's got a big old hippocampus. But what's that mean, right? When you think Michael Jordan, what do we think?
Yeah, it's instantly he's got this success, and he's this master of his trade. And then when you get careful and you turn into kind of the brain geek about why was Michael Jordan so successful, not only did he have a very healthy development of that hippocampus, his hippocampus probably was not blunted. And so you say, well, what would blunt the hippocampus? I'm like, head injury. Anytime you swell the brain, you're going to stop the growth of your hippocampus. So as that hippocampus is, again, when we look at a functional MRI of a developing brain, we can see which cells are actually dividing, how intensely they're dividing, and then we can map it out saying how long and how thick and how large will that part of the brain grow to be.
Wow.
The more head injuries they have, the less likely it's going to be to fully develop. The beautiful part of a teenage brain is if it does get an injury, it will shoot cleanup for a period of time if you leave it enough time before that 26th year. So if you get that head injury and you say, oh, I'm forever going to be, more stupid than I would have been without that head injury. You're like, well, you did blunt something, but a teenager can they can catch up, they can make up for that injury, as long as that brain doesn't swell again, especially the cells of the hippocampus.
Wow.
So when you look at my brain, well, I turned 51 2 days ago, and
happy birthday.
Thank you.
You did it.
And that my hippocampus is as long and as thick as it will get.
Yeah, done.
It's done growing, especially the length of it. I will not ever be able to add a length to it. We have learned that if there's a slight injury to the hippocampus, it can restore some of the volume, but it is slow. It is very difficult to get it to do that, and it requires, that's what my job is to, how do I get inside that part of that brain and give it the best chemistry set to get their brain back to what it would have been before an injury. So as you look at these teenagers with head injuries, so Michael Jordan did not have any head injuries.
Yeah.
Other things he had that were really good for his brain development is he had stable sleep. That brain development is much better when they've got a bedtime that's set and a wake-up time that's set.
Did you happen, just because he's an intriguing person, right? He's one of the more famous people in our country, right? Like recognized all over the world for his greatness, his business sense and savviness after playing basketball at the highest level, 6-time, champion, everything else, and that 10-part series that came out, the Last Dance. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but for anyone listening, if you want to know more about him or you're intrigued by him in any way and want to see, get inside his head, watch that series, The Last Dance, because it gives you insight into the way he was a clean living type guy. He would see people doing things like young 20-year-old guys in the NBA who he was at one point, right? A rookie or a first-year guy. And I think he was invited into a hotel room or something for a party to drink and girls and all that. And he was like, nope, this isn't going to get me anywhere. And he was known for not participating in that stuff and getting, as you said, the sleep, which is absolutely critical to
that brain development. Right. I mean, he had some other gifts that I think are really powerful. He had 2 parents that stayed married.
Yes.
That seems like, well, what does that matter? But that stability in a child, adverse childhood experiences are really known for blunting the fullest growth and development of a human brain. So he didn't have that. He's known for not being a drinker, not being a drugger, no documented head injuries. Basketball still can hurt the head, but that isn't in his history. And then he has had his hippocampus measured. He's had some MRIs and stuff done where we have data to say that volume is impressive. And I don't remember the numbers of it, but it's powerful to see.
Wow.
Here's what that transferred into. the other part that you look at, you say, well, what's the other grab that you would want people to do this? Is the bragging rights that he has is to add new skill sets in the level of the game that he was playing after the age of 30 is like unheard of.
Yeah.
Like the ability for him to continually add new skill sets as late in his brain development, we had not seen that before. So again, a very powerful example of what happens when you get the best, most enriched growth of a brain.
Wow.
And so you say, well, what else could have blunted that development, that growth of a hippocampus?
Yeah.
And so the first thing that usually comes when I'm teaching clients, or as I was teaching these middle schoolers, was alcohol. And so, you bring in alcohol. Alcohol gets swallowed. It crosses that blood-brain barrier. And that's the purpose of drinking alcohol, is to dissociate, is to have this feeling of euphoria, of relax, of improved social skills.
Yeah, inhibited.
There you go. That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
It's like you're in an environment where maybe you're a little bit uncomfortable. Like, let's say you're a single person and you're out at the bar, or like that. Why does drinking go so well with socializing? It's because it kind of brings down the barriers, and it allows people to feel more comfortable in like talking or socializing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And that's what makes it, pardon me, such an attractive thing.
Right.
Have a drink. Have two.
Yeah. And it truly is something that almost every teenager, or especially middle schooler by this point, has had parents to talk about or had some awareness of. The other thing that has been highly funded across our schools over the last decade has been what happens when you have a concussion.
Yes. It's gotten a lot of press in the last, and the NFL was probably like, because for a while they were kind of squashing that as a thing, but then it kind of was busting at the seams, and all these retired guys with
severe head
injuries and stuff. So it started getting a lot of press in the last 10 to 15 years, maybe more.
Yeah, and the funding is all the way down to your middle school.
Right. So and it's for good reason.
Yeah, it's
right?
absolutely.
For contact sports, we should know all the data. We should have the protection in place for the kids.
Yeah. Absolutely. No arguments against that. Maybe a little overfunded, because if you want to do any teaching inside of middle school and you want to get funded, you should just make sure you also teach about concussions, because there's funding for this all over the place to teach.
Just add that into your repertoire, right? Yeah, your curriculum.
And so I was not paid for this. This was a volunteer thing that I did, but I started with the kids saying, I want you to help me. Stand up if you've ever had a concussion. And these are middle schoolers. And so I have them stand up, and I'm like, all right, you get to sit down when you tell me one symptom that you had while having your concussion. And we'd go through, and they'd say, oh, I was sleepy. Oh, I had a headache. I had, my vision was off. I threw up. I couldn't remember the name of my memory was funny. I wanted to sleep. And I put up about 30 different things on the board. And then I said, now, sit down. The rest of you stand up. Have you ever you're the witnesses of a concussion. So whatever isn't on the board, I want you to tell me, what did it look like when you saw somebody who had a head injury? And so they'll talk about, boy, they were stumbling. They couldn't really balance very well. Their speech was slurred. When you look in their eyes, one eye didn't look right. And you have kids tell these stories. And then they go on to say, well, and, the one guy passed out and they had to take him by ambulance. And then I said, can you die from having a head injury? And then eventually one of the kids will say, yeah. I'm like, how do you die? And like, they stop breathing. Like, yes, they do. The cause of that is that the swelling inside that brain is contained in a skull, a bone. And when that swelling gets so heavy, we have this calculation that we do in the ICU to say, the brain is being pushed down that foramen magnum, that hole at the bottom of the skull.
Yeah.
And if it pushes too hard, it will cut off the nerve that makes them breathe. And they're like, oh my goodness. Yeah. Everybody's kind of grossed out a little. And I said, well, if I think that's going to happen, if I'm running the ICU and I'm doing this calculation, it's getting worse and worse and worse, and we see this little kid's brain is swelling too much, we'll cut out part of that skull, lay it next to the table on his bed, and say, well, at least the swelling is going to go up instead of down that hole.
Oh, my goodness.
And 48 hours later, that swelling is down enough. We can put the skull back in and they have a scar on their head, but at least they're not dead.
Wow.
Okay, so now you've got the room's attention by this point.
Yeah, I would say so.
And so then I said, all right, I want you to imagine something that I'm sure none of you have ever done, but you should know about. I want to hear what it's like to be drunk or hungover. And by now I have this whiteboard filled with all these words. And they start saying, well, drunk people slur their speech. Drunk people have a headache. Drunk people can't walk straight. Drunk people can't remember very well. Drunk people throw up. Drunk people's eyes look funny. And before I really worked to pull out and make sure most of the words are covered. Okay, look at that. Isn't that strange that nearly all of these are covered at the same, the same.
Right.
And so I usually have left the word death in big letters. Say, well, can you die from too much alcohol? And they all say alcohol poisoning. And I'm like, how does alcohol poison you? And then there's usually silence. I try to get the teachers to do their audience participation.
And now they're thinking too.
Holy
they're
mackerel.
like,
What are you talking about, lady? Didn't you come here to talk about marijuana?
Right.
Like, we're going to get there.
We're getting there.
And I said, well, what does, they stop breathing? Oh, well, how do they stop breathing? And eventually they realize, it's a swollen brain. All of these happen because the brain, which was swollen from a head injury, when you look at alcohol's impact on that brain, it is for every one alcohol molecule, it pulls in about 8 water molecules. Wow. So it swells the cellular level at this point, or at the point of the brain. And that swelling is highly connected to the rate at which, first of all, everybody that drinks that feels alcohol feels it because alcohol is alcohol swelled their brain. Mm-hmm. That dissociation was all of these symptoms that are up there because they did some swelling of the brain. But when they swell the brain so fast that it's swelling enough to push down on that foramen magnum, that same nerve at the back of their brain gets pinched off. And instead of being in my ICU where I can calculate what the level of their swelling is, they're laying on a fraternity floor and nobody's noticing. And that brain swelling is how people die from alcoholism. And so you look at that impact on the swelling from a hippocampal injury or a brain injury from a football injury. We know that it takes 6 months before that brain will start to grow and develop again. The injury was swollen for 3-4 days, and will go back to normal. And that's if they're in the right protocol to get the pain to go away. Alcohol, very similar. Water-soluble molecule comes into that body, and it will penetrate the cells of the brain, swell the brain. It will stop the growth of that hippocampus. And the brains, to get them to grow again after they've been swollen in adolescence, and this is of course done in animal models. If we go in and we try to stimulate a brain it's stopped, it's not dividing, it's not maturing like it's supposed to because we gave it a brain injury. But we go in there and we try to stimulate those cells to divide. Hey, we want you to grow again. We're going to try to manipulate that brain back into maturing. But the cells don't turn out like they're supposed to. They're funky looking.
They're like mutated.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So there is a protective reason. I mean, there's a whole bunch of science behind why that happens. But the punchline is there's protection in your brain's not going to divide and grow until it can do a good job. Wow. So that swelling needed to stay away for 6 months if you want it to continue growing your hippocampus. If you want to be the Michael Jordan.
It's like a waiting period. Your brain's like, no, it's not good. We're not ready yet.
Right.
We're going to hold off. We're not going to do that deal yet until everything's lined up.
So when you see people who start drinking at 15 years old, but they they drink every weekend and watch to see what their brains do over that growth of time, we know that they need to not drink for months on end in order to not re-swell the brain, not re-injure the brain, which is what alcohol does.
Wow.
And so you say, well...
Now I feel guilty for all those dumb, drunken moments that I've had because I was a dumb boy, and you have 3 boys.
Yes, I get it.
And I mean, they've made some blunders, right? And
Yep.
we all did. And luckily, by my mid-20s, I had done enough dumb stuff that but I really wish I could go back, like with my mentality now, and relive those last 5-6 years in my early 20s to maximize my hippocampal growth. Darn it.
Yeah.
I can't go back.
And I think what's interesting is when you look at the approach that parents have to drinking, and you'll still find some that, it's a rite of passage. My son should be able to do that. My daughter, I
That's
did
right.
this, let him do it. And you say, well, let's compare that alcohol intoxication or brain swelling to what happens when they smoke a joint. So the alcohol comes in, it swells up 1 to 8, and it's a water-soluble molecule. It's out of the body within 48 hours. Like
Yes.
if you get drunk on Friday night and you come to see me on Monday, I can't find any alcohol in you on Monday. It's gone. Now, the consequences of it will be what we talked about. But if you smoke a marijuana, if you inhale or ingest or swallow marijuana, the THC inside marijuana is a fat-soluble molecule, which is...
And we didn't talk about what's our brain.
Yeah, our
primarily.
brain is mostly fat.
80%, right?
80% fat. Yep, and that's a healthy, beautifully made brain is almost 80% fat.
Wow.
So when you look at things that can cross the blood-brain barrier, lots of fat molecules cannot, but THC, as you know, can. And you're like, well, how would I know that? Because you get a dissociation whenever you take it in. It is consumed for its dissociative effects. Mm-hmm. And when you look at where it binds to those cannabinoid receptors in the brain, much of which I'll hear my patients that love their cannabis say, we naturally have these endocannabinoid receptors, so we must have been meant to take this.
That's right.
We have receptors that are naturally designed to bind alcohol too, but it doesn't mean we named them based on what molecules bound to them. So
right.
Your reasoning has a few
Let's
steps.
get away from the semantics of it, right, and just look at what else are we learning from these metrics? Yeah.
So when you look at where a fat-soluble molecule binds to, well, first of all, it'll bind to the receptors that it's supposed to. That's that endocannabinoid. It does have a relaxing effect. It does decrease pain. And we naturally make an endocannabinoid molecule that stimulates that receptor. That's how we relax on our own. That's how we suppress pain. When we supersede that with an exogenous form of that molecule, it comes into our body and brain. And when you look at all the receptors that are in your brain, it will get bound up, and that's how you get high. But especially in today's world, the amount of THC inside marijuana or the edibles or the waxes or whatever version we're looking at has an abundant amount of these molecules that enter into the brain. And when all the receptors are filled, the extras hang out in like substances.
Yeah.
Which means it hangs out in fat.
I love and obviously the video version of this podcast. So anyone listening right now, if you want to see some of this stuff, we obviously in the show notes and the show description, we have a link to the video of Dr. Boz teaching this, and you can watch her slideshow. But we also have our YouTube channel, the Strong by Design YouTube channel, that we are having this video out there, and we will be cutting into your webinar so you can see some of this stuff. I was fascinated just watching it because you have this great stuff, and it's like it's how you would teach a kid,
exactly.
Right? It's like pictures and like this thing and this lights up, and then you have the joint and you have the joint burning, and then you have the THCs that come off, and they're sticky, these THC, and this is what you're getting to is. They're not only binding at these receptor sites, but these extra ones, they have nowhere to go. So where do they go?
Yeah, they land in every one of those. One of those, you could say wires. They're not wires, but they're nerves that have one message of the brain go to the next, and then ping pong around your brain to give you the functioning brain that we have, the most advanced brain on Earth. Those connections are all lined with insulation. The insulation is fat. Mm-hmm. That fat will suck in that THC and it will park in the fat. Not so that it can go later park in a receptor, it's stuck. It's stuck in the goo, and it's going to stay there until it disintegrates. So one of the other gross but very educational points I make in as I'm teaching these middle schoolers is I say, when we study this, we study mice. And PETA does not attend my lectures, so I'm.
Well, it's better we test on mice than little children, right? I mean, so we got to learn things as well as we can, right?
Right. So these mice are put into an area we want to study. Well, how long does that stay in their brain? And so we put these tiny little mice in there, and especially right before puberty, we put a joint in there. We have the air that they're breathing be filled with THC smoke, and they are breathing this air. We're now trying to decide. We want to dissect their brain, and I asked the students, well, how would I know if they've inhaled enough marijuana that I can check to see is it in their brain? And I make them start guessing, and they're like, well, maybe they got the munchies. Like, sure, maybe their behavior was isolated. Maybe they got anxious. So you can start to see that the education, even in middle school, is that marijuana has some side effects. And so they start to say, maybe they look really relaxed. Oh, maybe their pupils are bloodshot. I'm like, yeah, but that just shows exposure. I'm looking at, do they have a high enough dose that I can measure the extra marijuana in their brain? And it takes a while before usually I push them to say, I give them about 4 guesses, and then I tell them, say, no, we do a little liposuction. And they're like, what? I'm like, I take a needle and we put it into their fat pad in their tummy and we suck out some of the fat. Because the fat in their brain is just like the fat in their tummy.
That's right.
Will suction in the extra molecules of THC. We squirt that fat onto a microscope and we can see the THC beads inside the fat cells. And when we get a high enough concentration that for every 10 cells of fat we see that 6 of them have marijuana in it, we say, okay, now we're going to stop exposing them to marijuana and we're going to time how long does it stay in the brain.
Wow.
And so then we say, okay, let's cut some heads off at the end of 1 week. Are they still in their brain at 1 week? Oh yeah, plenty. I mean, we do it right we sacrifice a few brains just to see what was our number.
Yeah.
Okay, then what is it at 1 week? And then what was it at 2 weeks? And what was it at? Take a guess how long it took before the brain no longer had any THC beads in the brain.
2 months.
Yeah, it was actually 12 weeks, 11 to 12 weeks, so almost 3 months. Yeah. And when that THC molecule is hanging out in the goo of their fat in their brain, do you think it causes swelling?
Oh, without question.
Without question.
It's not really supposed to be there, right? Don't things swell up when there's something foreign or something that's not supposed to be there? I had a family member who recently had his 3rd knee surgery. Oh. I know, on the same knee. Well, his first one was a botched job, and then he went to get to another good guy who did a good fix on it, but then he ended up with a big deposit that grew like a big calcium deposit. And why did he end up with that? Because there was an irritant or inflamed tissue, right? And there growths and swelling and things happen when it's not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, that body will fight to get that to go away. Inflammation is a sign things don't belong here, and it's working for your benefit. But just like in the knee that constantly causes pain, it doesn't feel very beneficial. You wouldn't think that's what's happening. In your brain, when those exogenous molecules are in places they don't belong, that immune system is trying to get rid of it. It's trying to say, this doesn't belong here. And it is swollen. It is inflamed. So much like the cause of the alcohol was for one reason of swelling, but the cause of marijuana and its chronic swelling is a different set of mechanics, but very measurable. And when you say, well, what do we know about functional MRIs of developing teenagers when they've had marijuana exposure? We also can see that they, especially if it was a tagged marijuana, it stays in their brain for 3 months.
Yeah.
But then it's 6 months after that the swelling must stay out of their brain
for things to
start growing again.
Wow.
So if you want to have a hippocampus that measures up to Michael Jordan, and you say, but doc, my teenager, I gave them a head injury and we got better, and then a little marijuana made them feel better. I'm like, not in the, back up, look at the mechanism by which that treatment plan was being implemented in. and the pathology that is mandated because of the molecule that you're using.
Wow. And that concludes part 1 with Dr. Boz, a truly fantastic conversation that we can't wait for you to hear the rest of. We will continue this conversation in next week's episode. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for listening to the Strong by Design podcast. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe so that more people can find out about our show. Plus, you don't want to miss any future episodes with the amazing guests and topics we have lined up for you.